Hey,
Okay, so
good to see you.
thanks for joining.
Pleasure, pleasure.
And, again, thanks for everybody that's in this important day of bringing crypto health to the world. Why don't we start by you just telling a little bit about yourself and because you're not a doctor, right?
No, no,
So,
I'm
so
not a
tell a little bit
doctor.
about yourself and why you think you're here in this crypto health track.
So, okay, there are really sort of two sides to my background. In terms of my corporate background, I've headed up digital innovation and digital marketing, commerce, etc., for large enterprises for the last sort of 15 years. So I'm culminating essentially with heading up digital for automotive, aerospace, and defense for IBM. And so I really sort of specialized in working across really complex industries that are highly regulated, primarily around consumer engagement, so consumer internet, consumer digital engagement, and really working at that nexus point between technology and culture and how that can be used in commerce. In that journey, I became very interested in data and personal data and how that can be used to improve our experience of the internet most initially. But then as I looked at that further, I then became fascinated with the role that it plays in improving our lives generally. So that's a journey I've been on for the last decade. And there's a big inflection point about 5 years ago where we set up an NGO, and this was essentially it was triggered by Snowden Gate, whereby we'd already started to see that as we looked at the personal data space, that there were big social issues around the use of our data in commerce or the use of our data generally. And so we became quite focused on privacy and identity. And as we looked at things like the Arab Spring, we could see that people's lives were being put in danger by their digital footprint. So we started to look at this from a human rights perspective. And then when Snowden Gate happened, we realized that we needed to take an advocacy positioning on this. So we set up an NGO to advocate for a universal declaration of digital rights as an extension of human rights. And also to figure out what was a responsible and sustainable way to use personal data in commerce. And then a final thing really about how could we use data to help people to improve and empower their lives.
So you said a lot of things, and I want to try to unpack that before we dive into healthcare per se. Clearly from David's talk, all the sensors that are out there, healthcare is a very data-rich environment. With like 160 some exabytes of data, and when you talk about a universal declaration of data rights or clean data, or can you kind of explain that to us a little bit about? I think it's called the Internet Foundation, right?
That's
so
right.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about? We understand what brought you to do that, but really, what does that mean in practical terms to have this charter?
Sure. So I think if you look at the 20th century, it started with World War I, and then halfway through we had World War II. One of the big outputs of World War II was we came to a consensus as a species that we have inalienable rights. So human rights were established effectively. And those principles are very solid and very well grounded in terms of essential global citizenship rights, rights that everybody on the planet should essentially have. But as we move into this digital era, those principles need not so much redefining, but they need interpreting in a digital context. What does the right to free assembly mean in a digital context? What does the right to free speech mean in a digital context? What does the right to property mean? What does the right to privacy mean? All of these things need re-understanding in the context of a digital society. And that's essentially what we mean by digital human rights. And of course, you touched on clean data, which is another term that we coined in part of this journey, because everybody talks about data as the oil of the 21st century, and it's all about data, 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 as we know today. But we see the problem with that is that the approach that we have to data today is very predatory, and it's basically, we call it a dirty data paradigm, and this paradigm is literally dirty data. So you look at the surveillance capitalism machinery or industrial complex, and the manipulation economy that's come from that, which the internet has become a driving force for. And you look at the data that's in the system that's used by the FANG companies to track and surveil us and influence us. And a lot of that data is actually dirty in a sense. One, what do we mean by that? One, it's not accurate. Two, it's not consented. Three, it's toxic. Four, it's becoming illegal, or it's become illegal in many parts of the world, most especially in California. Give a hand to California for the Consumer Privacy Act, really progressive legislation here in that regard. So it's become illegal in that sense. So, and we compare this to where the energy industry was 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago. And what we're now trying to create is a clean data paradigm whereby its data is filtered by ownership, consent, self-sovereignty agencies and the like.
So I hear here now two things. One is kind of more straightforward that I think occupies what we're thinking of on a daily basis, and another one a little bit more subtle. So I want you to kind of respond to that. The obvious thing is that, like you said, we're surrounded by centralized predatory practices. You mentioned Snowden, the NSA, Fanga. Every other day we're looking, at how someone lost our data or profiting on it. Yesterday we spoke on the panel about Memorial Sloan Kettering, selling data to companies, or 23andMe sending our genetic data to third parties without our consent. Is this really a problem of practice? So the impetus of the foundation is just to create a legal framework? Or is there something deeper where data is actually part of our identity? Is it part of who we are? So we have to kind of think of that a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, and you asked the question, how do I come to be here? And what I think this very quickly gets to a conversation about health and wellness in the most fundamental sense. So, absolutely, data is essential to identity. And you and I have had really interesting conversations about this. One of the things there's a game that's being played in the industry at the moment around personal data, and there's the idea of personally identifiable information, and anonymization is a big deception that's going on at the moment. And you and I have spoken about identity versus identifiability. And what you get to very quickly, and where this becomes really important, is that when you look at identity, if you take the lens of PII, then the notion is that your name, your social security number, your driving license number defines who you are. That's your identity. So the idea is that you have these so-called objective data sets that define who you are. That's absurd when you really think about it, because who you are, when you think about things like, gender identity is a massive issue today, for example. This is not about your name. This is not about a number. It's about what you believe in. It's about what you feel. So identity is actually a really subjective thing as opposed to an objective thing. Now, the trick is that subjective data really defines who you are. But objective data, i.e., where are you? What do you like? What do you eat? What do you read? Who are you talking to? Who are your friends? Who are your enemies? What have you shared? These objective bits of information actually form unique patterns. And these unique patterns make you very identifiable. So even though we can argue what identity is, identifiability is really the big issue. So the idea that you can remove PII from your digital footprint and be anonymous is nonsensical, because actually your entire footprint is an expression of who you are, and it makes you identifiable.
So no, and this is super interesting, and I'm thinking, so I'm someone who wakes up too early in the morning and drinks way too much coffee, and I'm way too much on my email, so definitely all of you can identify me. Is it really, when you think of data, and then we'll talk a little bit more about health data, and then we'll move to the MetaMe project that you're developing, is it really more about security? Is it more about privacy? Is it more about ownership? Are they all the same? Is it sequential? How did you kind of describe that interplay between the privacy, the security, and the ownership?
So one of the challenges with data, personal data particularly, is you've got very polarized elements. So if you take something like security and privacy, these are very different things from ownership. And this is a challenge that people in the blockchain space lose a lot. So immutability is particularly relevant when it comes to ownership. So if you look at things like refugees or people who are displaced, who've been chased out of their countries and they've no longer claim to their property or their identity for that matter, immutability plays a massive role in terms of the blockchain can solve that problem because we can give people immutable ownership of these assets, their identity, their things effectively. But when it comes to privacy, it's the complete opposite. Immutability is actually a real problem when it comes to privacy, because privacy is about being able to control who has access and visibility to information about you. So quite often, this is the complexity of the spaces that you have to look at polarizing components and use different technical solutions to address those different needs. So when it comes to privacy, the key thing is agency. What is really critical is to give people the ability to control who has access. And the greatest expression of agency is ownership. And this is in the legal fabric of the world. If you look at the history of law, the Magna Carta, it all was born out of property rights. And property law is actually the most advanced law that we have generally as a society. So these things are interrelated, but they are different, and they need different consideration based on what you're trying to achieve.
I see. And for the audience, those who don't know, in American English, privacy is privacy, right? So that we know. But on a more serious, so tell us a little bit about MetaMe. I know you have a couple of slides. I don't know if you want to show them, but tell us a little bit about the MetaMe project and what this is about, and how does that pertain to these elements of agency and privacy that you've been talking about.
And then maybe we'll come back to health, because I think that's a really important part of it. So essentially, the Internet Foundation is setting up what we call the Metapod protocol. And this is a universal framework for the management of personal data in an ethical manner, leading to the ethical use of it in commerce. And at the heart of this is this principle of data ownership, that we give people a means of owning their data. And I think a lot of people in this space in the blockchain crypto space, are trying to solve that problem. We all share the same why. The difference in terms of how we go about it is we create data containers, which we call metapods. And we liken these data containers to shipping, how shipping containers were for the cargo industry. In 1958, the shipping container was created, as recently as that, and that was the driver of the global economy. And so at a foundation level, when you look at I think you can play, oh, he is playing the slides. So if you go to the first slide there, so our notion is that the crypto economy is crypto money and crypto data. Now, crypto money is somewhat well-defined, but we don't have an objective way of objectifying data. And I liken all the data protocols and approaches that we have at the moment. It's sort of like light physics. You know, when Einstein was developing the theory of relativity, there was a big debate, is light a wave or is it a particle? And he was the first person to unify this and say that, well, sometimes it's a light, sometimes it's a wave, sometimes it's a particle. All the approaches to data management to date treat data like a wave. So it's something that flows, that is caught in these ponds or these lakes or these oceans, and it's all about sort of managing access and security around the perimeter. We treat data as a particle, and in treating data as a particle, you can stop it and you can objectify it, and you can therefore make it something that is something much more easy to trade, own, or share accordingly.
So the idea, because I can feel the urgency in the crowd, is so this platform would allow me now to do what? And then we'll talk a little bit about health, but
Sure.
just so like my life now, okay, I think that identity is awful, everybody's stealing it from me, I can't control about everything. You're trying to convince me that actually it's better because I have more ways to express myself in my identity and identifiability. And so the question here is, okay, now with the MetaMe platform, what
Sure.
can I do?
So it gives you a means of taking ownership of your data, collecting it all into a single place that you have sole custody and ownership of it. And what the metapods then enable you to do is to extract pieces of that as needed and to share them with third parties in a safe and secure manner. And this therefore means that you can then put these in marketplaces, so you can then share them, trade them, buy them, sell them with enterprises or service providers that can provide you services around that. So it's really flipping the model around the data economy, around giving people a piece of the pie and a way to engage in that marketplace in a safe, sovereign way. There are lots of people who are trying to enable people to earn money from their data and the like, but we haven't found a way as an industry yet to actually create these data objects that bring that vision to life. And that's what Metapods do and what MetaMe does. Then MetaMe specifically on top of that then gives you a personalized AI, which helps you manage all the complexity and all the difficulty in bringing that complex data set to bear so that you can do it in an intuitive and, easy way that doesn't require you to have to think hard about which data am I sharing with whom, when, etc. accordingly.
And so this ties into what we said yesterday on the main stage, where the blockchain impact, what we wish, one of the impacts of blockchain, at least for consumers, is going to be to transform people from passive consumers of health to active producers of health and wealth. And so by using, for example, the MetaMe platform, you'll actually have something that you can trade with. Is that a correct depiction?
Absolutely, and I loved what you were talking about yesterday. You're absolutely right. It's about becoming health producers, which should translate to wealth producers. And as you identified yesterday, if someone has an opioid addiction and they wean themselves off that, that's a saving to insurers, to the industry of circa 25K an annum. So that's significant. That's a significant saving. And even if it's a 50-50 split, that's a significant income to someone. And if you can imagine where they have the freedom to invest that kind of money in crypto assets, for example, that could be the birth of a fortune for an individual in that sense. So absolutely, our model is really about how do you give people control of their data in a way that they can use it to improve their lives. And that's very comprehensive, because when you look at something like opioid addiction, for example, understanding the patterns of how you behave from your data is already a value that you create. Using your data to sell and to sell your data to people to demonstrate changes that you're making, or to earn rewards, or to engage with an economic system or a marketplace is another way to sort of improve and add value to your life.
So we have this afternoon actually a panel about opioid addiction, not how to treat it, but different people will be on board that have developed blockchain-based solutions to either prevent or treat secondary or tertiary care for opioids. Do you see what you're doing as something that plugs in to that? Is that something like almost like a foundational? Are we looking at the Ethereum of data, kind of a foundational protocol that might be used in?
Yeah, so there's a few things there. I'll race through a couple of them that are important. So one of the important things about the MPOD protocol is that it's chain agnostic or even more, chain holistic. So effectively, MPODs are interoperable across any chain. And I think that's a really important thing for us as an industry right now, to be more cohesive, because we're just a blip on the behind of the tech industry and the finance industry. And unless we're more cohesive, we're not going to be a realistic alternative. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is, so when you speak a lot about isolation and about health being about the opposite of health being isolation, and that's absolutely true, and I don't think there's anywhere that's more acute in the opioid space, because it's isolation that drives this illness. And in many ways, I think an important point is that identity is fundamentally a struggle between the way that we as individuals perceive ourselves and the way that we want to impress how we see ourselves on the world, and the way that the world sees us and that it wants to impress on us how it sees ourselves. And this is a struggle, it's a dichotomy. And in that, when that struggle is really out of kilter, people become ill. And this is really perhaps one of the foundations of illness in that sense. So in this journey between this where I see myself and I want to impress upon the world how I see myself versus how I'm being told by the world I am being perceived, there is a sharing, there's an interaction. And particularly as people become ill, then the flow of information around becomes really key. Who has access to what when? So, you know, if someone's suicidal, for example, and they want counsel or they want to talk to people, they probably want, in less acute cases, they probably benefit from being able to talk to people anonymously around that. And this is where our platform really becomes key, because we're the first comprehensive framework to manage anonymity, proper anonymity, all the way through to identifiability.
But that point is, it's really interesting. You're saying, you know, how I present to the world versus how the world perceives me, and this interaction. It almost seems like, actually, and correct me if not, that we're better off now with identity. Everybody feels that we're actually not, that everybody's taking a piece of our identity. We have no, but it sounds almost to me that we can create our own identity, our digital twin, if you wish. That is something that would have been harder before. It could be almost a immortal, you know, digital for multiple generations. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, or what's going on with that?
So I spend a lot of time trashing on Facebook. A lot. But there are two sides to the story, and you're absolutely right. You know, historically, as recently as 50 years ago or 30 years ago, the only people who really got to impress their identity on the world in a way that they controlled were celebrities or aristocrats or captains of industry, to an extent. Most of the rest of us, our identities all second-hand, you know, even our names are given to us by our parents, bless them, and it's great, it's a fantastic thing, but we didn't choose our names, we didn't choose our social security number, we didn't choose our credit profile, our zip code. Yeah. I mean, okay, as you get older, perhaps you start to become more agent in terms of driving that. But it's a very powerful thing that social media has done. Yes, now you can say it's frivolous and people are just putting forward the best side of themselves, but that's something that the masses have never been able to do historically. So, and this is a really important point, because while, of course, from everything I've said, you know how passionate I am about giving people protection of their digital rights and all whatnot and their data and this stuff. But the counter side of it is that never before in history have people had so much ability to craft their identity, to manage how the world sees them. And that's a good thing. It's a thing, it's an act of consciousness in many senses. So it makes people more evolved.
Well, this is fascinating. I want to ask one last question before I give it to the audience. are we ready for all this? I have this sense that in the last 25 minutes we've had this very sophisticated discussion on data and identity that I was totally unprepared for. And I'm just thinking, we're going out there, out of this room. Do people want to be masters of their data? Do people want to create that digital twin? Do people at all understand, or if it's just a thing? And so then we reside at the end just to the objective little stuff around and just pay me some money and that's it. So what say you about that?
It's a great question. And we ran a UX workshop last week, and it was startling to me because halfway through the workshop, I realized that I needed to stop thinking the way that I had been thinking and stop talking to people the way that I had been talking. And so we started the workshop asking people, what do you think the internet knows about you? And it's like, okay, it knows where I live, it knows what I like, it knows what I eat, it knows where I go, it knows whom I like, who I sleep with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can fill in the blanks yourself, right? And from that, it became clear to everyone that actually you do have a digital self, whether you accept or acknowledge it or not. But what actually became really interesting, we started talking about Amazon, Alexa, and as you talk to Alexa, how that's changing. Like kids, for example, have this command language now, like do this, and etiquette and things like that. But what became really interesting to me through the conversation is that we are developing this relationship with the machine. We are training the machine now. People are talking about Spotify and how it's great because it knows what I like and it comes up with these recommendations. And I can trust it because I pay a subscription versus Alexa, who I don't really know how I trust. And as I was listening to all these conversations, I realized that we are already intimately engaged with the machine, with the robot, with our digital selves. We're just not conscious of it. And we're also kind of helpless and hopeless about it. People said things like, giving Alexa and Amazon all of my data, that's the price of living in the world today. It's kind of really Faustian, right? So there is a need that I think is now rising to consciousness. And I think people are ready, but the challenge for us as technologists is to give people the tools that are simple and easy to use for them to express this need that is already latent.
Got it. Well, at least now I know why my 12-year-old is commanding me all the time, because she thinks I'm Alexa and I'm actually Alex. So that's we're almost, is there anybody in the audience that wants to ask Dele something about his fascinating project, both the Internet Foundation and MetaMe, or general about data and health? Anyone? Yes, please.
Out of curiosity, how mature or how developed is the MetaMe project as it stands?
So the question was, how mature are the projects?
Yeah, I think around MetaMe specifically, how that advanced that is today. So we've essentially built a centralized Web 2.0, if you will, prototype or that we've run tests with some financial institutions in pilots, and we are currently building out the Web 3.0 stack, and by the end of this year we'll have demos, we'll be demo ready with the 3.0 stack, where we've created blockchain-enabled MPODs, and we'll be running pilots with enterprises from Q1, Q2 next year.
Okay. Well, listen, Dele, this was fascinating. Thank you so much.